Welcome to this episode of Fossils and Fiction, a podcast that explores the stories of prehistoric life, most often through the stories we humans tell about it. It's produced by me, Travis Holland, with support from Charles Sturt University. Enjoy. Hi, I'm Travis Holland. Welcome to this episode of Fossils and Fiction. For this episode, I had a chat with a creative named Lucas Zellers. Lucas was the project lead on a D&D handbook called Book of Extinction, which tries to tell real stories about extinct animals before making them work for the D&D world. You'll know that I'm really interested in how we tell the stories of extinct animals, and I found Lucas to be a fascinating guest with some powerful insights. I hope you enjoy this episode. You've built a really interesting career. I had a look around your websites and various things I could find on the web. You do voice work and podcasts and creative writing and a book project, which we're going to get to. But before all that, tell me about the trajectory of your work, the things that interest you. What gets you out of bed in the morning?
I really don't want to start this question with well, I grew up when I was a child. Uh, but it's hard to get away from that. I grew up in rural Illinois, uh,
Mm-hmm.
the America's Great Midwest Plains. So for a long time, my work was really defined creatively. I guess my work was really defined by the same sort of cultural tension that defined most of my life, the difference between urban and rural and how they overlap. How do people in the city live and how do people in the country live? And a huge portion of that, there's a huge portion of my work that's also just dragons are cool, right?
Yep.
Just
Yeah,
desperately
no, I
hoping the
get
world will fall down into
it.
that fantasy with me. But from there, it's turned into this really fascinating conversation about otherness and how we talk about and to people who are different than us, and how that extends to the grace we give the natural world. Especially since in 2016, I was able to begin to do all of this through the language of Dungeons and Dragons, and
Mhm.
in that space between 2016 and 2023, it's gotten as big as it ever has been. And it's become this unified language of storytelling, the more so since it's now in the Creative Commons. So I have all of these influences, just like every artist does, but I also have this really incredible language in which to express them. And I think that's kind of what has made, that's definitely what has made my work possible over the past couple of years.
The Dungeons and Dragons thing really fascinates me. It's never been something I've been involved in, although you'll be pleased to know, I'm sure, that I am actually gearing up for my first campaign with some friends of mine. So
Yes, my guy.
yeah, I'm looking forward to it. But I haven't quite got my head into that space yet. So tell me how that's become a shaping theme or structure for you.
I can tell you the first time I played Dungeons and Dragons. Well,
Hmm.
before I started, I remember saying to a friend of mine, I don't think I'll ever play D&D because yes, I'm a nerd. Like yes, I read Tolkien, but I'm not that much of a nerd. Like D&D seems a bridge too far.
Yeah.
And here we are. um, but I remember the first session I played coming back from that and realizing that all this was structured make believe. It was make believe that could be handled and accepted by adults. Not that it's for them specifically, but that it tends to work better. And it's everything. Like there's no creative endeavor that doesn't have a home in Dungeons and Dragons. Like you want to be a writer, absolutely you're here. You want to be an artist, you're king in this world. You want to crochet, you want to embroider, heck, you want to do paper mache, get in here. We've got a place for you to be useful and appreciated and expressive in the context of this one game. And with that comes this bizarre cross section of humanity that the hobby represents. There, to a man, everybody that I've met, or to a person, I should say, everybody that I've met while playing this game and getting involved in designing for it and writing for it professionally has been truly a joy to be around. It's just been a like 7 years of very chill nerds helping me enjoy what I love to do. And that's, that's the fact that you can slice the world this way and come up with that kind of a cross section is endlessly fascinating to me.
7 years of very chilled nerds is a really nice. That's almost a good title for this for the episode. Look, but look, so we are going to talk about one of your D&D project, which is Book of Extinction. But before we get to that, I put a call out for someone to chat to me about Land Before Time, and so that is happening. I'm going to have an episode about Land Before Time, and it was mentioned actually in
Great.
the episode I've just published, with Vicky Cools as well. But when I put that call out, you replied to me and said that the film molded your brain. How did that work? I'm interested in that.
Yeah, it's one of those things that's like deep in there. Because I grew up in the height of the Disney Renaissance.
Hmm.
I don't know if this was as big in Australia as it was in America, but like for the 90s and early 2000s, it was the phrase now available to own on video cassette.
Yep,
And that
yep,
was my whole, that was my thing. But in the late 80s and early 90s, there was really only one person out there who had a shot at dethroning the mouse, and it was Don Bluth. He was an animator who split from Disney, I think, in '85, and he
yeah.
had a string of mild successes: All Dogs Go to Heaven, Balto, The Secret of Nim, and Anastasia, which, by the way, holds up. Uh, and so the Land Before every film that Don Bluth did was like uncanny in a way. It felt familiar but strange. Like it was a lot bouncier and a lot weirder in terms of content and a lot like grungier than Disney had a tendency to be. So whenever I encountered a Don Bluth film, it was always kind of this weird through the looking glass version of what I was used to. And so when I discovered The Land Before Time, it had that appeal already, but that movie was maybe the first movie that asked me, like that movie came out in 1989, so I was very young, single digit age when I saw it. And it was the first movie, I think, that asked me to imagine a mother's passing. That's act one.
Yeah, yeah.
Spoilers, by the way, for
Yeah, no,
a
it
30
opens
year
on
old
this
movie.
it opens on this like punch in the face, you know.
Yeah, it's rough, but it
Yeah.
was beautiful in a way I wasn't used to. It was emotionally compelling, and it made heroes out of dinosaurs. It sent them on this, heroic quest to find the promised land. And I mean, for all of those, it hit me in the right place at the right time. There's always a little thing in the back of my brain that I guess helped me just it made animals as real to me as people are.
Yeah. It's absolutely a lovely film, and that's why I really wanted to make sure I had an episode about it. And now it's ended up in 3 episodes, so that'll be great. But the real topic that I asked you that I thought we could chat about today is your work, which you did get some backing for on Kickstarter. So tell me about Book of Extinction.
Yeah, so Book of Extinction is a bestiary of extinct animals resurrected for Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition. We took 70 plus real life extinction stories that had happened uh, since the Holocene and then dipping back into the last ice age. We put together a team of some of the best D&D 5e designers that are in the third party space, some truly excellent fantasy illustrators. We brought on a science consultant and a horde of play testers and beta readers. And in all of that process, we've made something I think we can be really proud of. We brought it to Kickstarter in May of 2023, and over 2,300 backers pledged just about $195,000 to make this book a reality. So at the moment, we're about 80% through that process of getting it
Mhm.
into their hands. But it's safe to say that the book has found its audience. And they're the people who recognize the idea that I had when I put this together, which was people who recognized the importance of these stories in particular and the potential of tabletop role playing games to introduce them to the world in a way that no other medium can. to have these really participatory conversations about it and carry that meaning forward. So no worries, by the way, if you missed the Kickstarter, you can still pre-order it at magehandpress.com/extinction. So don't worry that it's
Yeah.
like only closed to the backers. It's out there and we're going to make it happen. It's going to take a while. So there's a little bit of time to get on board.
We'll make sure the links are in the show notes so people can access that and have a look up. But one of the stories that you tell in Book of Extinction is the thylacine. Now, being down here in Australia, and I know that most of my listeners, although not all, there's a good smattering around the world, are also Australian. That's one that's pretty close to our hearts and one of the great shames of our nation, really. What drew you to the thylacine?
I mean, you can't talk about extinction and not talk about the thylacine. So from the beginning, it was something that I knew I was going to have to do. And, I would have done it even if I hadn't been compelled. But if you Google extinction, you'll get a picture of the thylacine on the
Yeah.
Wikipedia page for it as the first result. So it was an absolute necessity to cover the thylacine. And it was one of the first ones I did. And it shaped the way that I put the book together. And it shaped a lot of the thoughts that I had about it. Um, to me, the thylacine is a story of fear, love, and denial, which is the same story that makes a monster a monster. As far as I know, from the research that I've done, before settlers from Britain arrived in the late 1700s, there was an entire ecosystem of old growth forests on Tasmania, and
Yeah.
most of the ecological niches that are filled elsewhere in the world by placental mammals were filled by marsupials there. So it must have seemed to the people in the first penal colony that they were in fairyland, Magmel, or Through the Looking Glass, this kind of uncanny sort of Don Bluth versus Disney fairy world that they had stepped into. So it's no surprise that um, the kind of apex predator, I don't know if it was an apex predator, but one of the most compelling and familiar shapes to them would have been the Tasmanian tiger. And the difficulty in describing it is brings difficulty in naming it. It was a tiger. It was the marsupial wolf. It was
Mhm.
known as a fox for a while. I think it might have been
Yeah, because
easily
it's quite
compared to a
small
coyote.
for a predator sort of thing. It's sort of the size of a medium domestic dog.
Yeah, it's not large.
No.
Tiger stripes and a jaw with a truly impressive gape that, and things get bigger when you're scared of them.
Yeah.
So a thing with a mouth proportionally this large, it's no wonder that the first boogeyman or the first scapegoat for the death of livestock and cattle was the thylacine. And there was a concerted effort, I think, in between 1835 and 1910 to exterminate the species from the island entirely.
Mm.
And most experts agree that it worked, although not all of them I have found.
We have this the Australian kind of mythology here. Well, within the sort of non-indigenous population, where the Americans have Bigfoot and those kind of myths, we have escaped mammals, and we have so there's like every small town in my part of the world has stories of sightings of panthers, and that there's supposedly this remnant population of panthers escaped from zoos or American servicemen or whatever, that sort of live in the national parks and is talked about, and the in Tasmania it's the Tasmanian tiger, it's the thylacine. People claim to see it, but nobody's ever provided proof of that. So
Yeah, and that's kind of the three prongs of this. Like it's um, fear. So when you look at how monsters are put together in myths and storytelling and in games, in literature and games, then you see so many commonalities with the I think every possible kind of monster, every role
mhm,
that a monster can play has been at one point or other played by the thylacine, from from fear of this like ghost tiger in the night that's going to take your livelihood and your life if you let it, to this thing that we love very much, as sort of a symbol of wildness and what could have been, and nostalgia in the sense that fantasy is great at doing, and also to denial, to say that you know it's still out there. I can't accept a world in which this
Yeah.
doesn't exist. Um, and I will say that the thylacine was one of the things that made this book what it is, because I knew that I was going to have to change gears really hard when I found out that the year of a creature's extinction is a matter of contention.
Mhm.
Like it's very, for a lot of very practical reasons, it's hard to establish when a creature goes extinct because absence of evidence, as you know, is not evidence of absence. So that meant footnotes, and that meant an entirely different kind of writing, and a whole lot of research had to go into the project just to be consistent and to be correct and to stand up to the scrutiny of the kind of Tasmanians who love this creature and are very protective of its history and its story. And for clarity's sake, I will say I love those people. Um, Even though you might think that getting a bunch of footnotes and suggested edits on your work would get old after a while, but with this
I'm an
particular kind
academic.
of
It's
yeah, then
stock and
you know,
trade.
but if you're doing it about something that you love and you feel is
Yeah.
valuable, it generally is never a genuinely is never a chore.
Yeah. There is always this tension between sort of fact and fiction when you're working with real animals and fitting them into stories. So, how do you balance that kind of thing? Do you just try and get it as accurate as possible, or do you lean a little bit the other way and say, well, ultimately, I am doing this for a storytelling purpose, and it has to fit that narrative.
Yeah, that's a tough line to walk. And we've done it, I think, a few different ways over the course of the entire book. In some cases, uh, in all cases, I've had the luxury of being extremely direct and explicit about my influences in the project. So I can say on the one page, this is what actually happened. And it is stranger than fiction. There are some buck wild stories in here that I couldn't have come up with if I tried. Uh, so it was important to me to tell them. Um, but when it came to the process of making the book what it is was the process of mythologizing these creatures into a context where they would be competitive in the world of
Mhm.
Dungeons and Dragons, which often meant sort of upscaling them a bit or adding magic back to them, or just riffing on an element of the story that I thought would really resonate with players of the game at the table. So we handled it a lot of different ways. In some cases, the story just sort of begged me to tell it in a certain way. In some cases, there was already a story involved.
Mhm.
So, for example, the Japanese wolf had a yokai that went along with it. They called it Okuri Inu or Okuri Okami. And there was already this whole suite of folklore and storytelling that was
Mhm.
about that. So when we told the story of the Japanese wolf, we just retold those stories as faithfully as we could. And in some cases, we just let our own imagination run wild, and try to write things that were faithful to the way Dungeons and Dragons is. What's fun and interesting in that game. In the case of the Stevens Island Wren, uh, we imagined a world in which the last Stevens Island Wren, or the last three of them rather, sort of fell through a rift to a different dimension back through that
Mhm.
looking glass to sort of the Feywild, this fairyland that D&D kind of uses as a pan-cultural usage. And then we were able to make them basically fairy Three Musketeers. They're a classic heroic trio, and I knew when I put them in people's hands that there would be a game master out there who would know how to embody these characters. This one is rash and bold, and this one is calm and calculating, and this one tries to keep the balance between them. So it was an opportunity to embrace what actually happened, to uh, to to really honor the stories that we've already told about it, and then to just have a lot of fun and give new tools and new stories to game masters to embody these stories um, and make new experiences with
Hmm.
them at their own table.
So you basically have two versions of each animal, right? You've got
Yeah,
the real world, the story, the fact version, and then the kind of fictionalized version of it.
yeah, and there's a tension here. So I can, if I can get a little crunchy for a second, Dungeons and Dragons has a scale that it ranks things on. For player characters, it's
Hmm.
levels 1 through 20. You start at level 1, and you maybe end at level 20 if
This
you
is going to
ever
be my
get
crash
there.
course.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. For monsters, it's challenge rating, and it's roughly equivalent. After about level 8, there are not beasts in the world. Like every that sorry, let me back up one more step. Because the other thing you need to know is that Dungeons and Dragons has a certain like resolution for the way that it looks at the world, and
Hmm.
instead of doing Linnaean classification or anything that's actually scientifically useful, it just splits every creature in the world into one of 13 categories, including aberrations, that's for your Cthulhu's and stuff, monstrosities, that's for your classic
Yeah.
monsters like griffins and hippogriffs, oozes, plants, undead, the whole shebang. But beasts are the ones that we would know. I've wrote 70 plus beasts, and all of our megafauna are beasts.
Yeah.
And beasts in the game don't usually, and I don't think we've broken this rule, have a challenge rating higher than 8.
Hmm.
So for roughly half the time, you are as an individual, as a player character, more powerful than any other living creature on this planet that isn't magical or altered or in some way hybridized into this sort of magical wizardly kind of world in which you operate. So it was necessary
Yeah.
by the strictures of the game for this to be anything other than just sort of a gift to the druids in the game, that we add a lot to the creatures that we were importing, and retell them in like bizarre and fantastic and impossible ways.
Yeah. You keep using the word monster, and there's this kind of in criticisms of paleo media, often there's this complaint that dinosaurs in Jurassic Park and Jurassic World and 65 and the Meg and all these other kind of vaguely paleo media things are monsterized, made
Yeah.
50% bigger or um, given kinds of bizarre behaviors or whatever it happens to be. But what do you make of that term monster? How do you see it fitting in the world? How do you see that term playing out?
I love this question because I've spent 3 years trying to get an answer to it. And at this point, I have more questions than I have answers. So I can tell there's like two really important things at work here. And one of them is the way that Dungeons and Dragons uses the word monster. And I can't help, and certainly our conversation has been infected by that usage because D&D has to solve a very particular problem. And that is telling a disparate group of people how to play this game. So
Hmm.
in many ways, it resembles more of a technical manual than it does any other kind of writing. It's not a novel. These source books, it's not it's not a field guide, although it owes a lot to that structure. It's a technical manual for how you run this game. And when you do technical writing, words have to mean very specific things. So for Dungeons and Dragons, it's not interested in any of the sort of philosophical implications of this. It leaves that to you to sort it out. Anything that is not a player character is a monster.
Hmm.
Like that's just that's how we refer to them in the book. So a pigeon is a monster. A frog, by this definition, is a monster. Um, and a monster is anything that has a stat block, anything that can be interacted with in the game, and that's really useful for putting this game together. it's incredible. It muddies the waters significantly when you try to extract that into a larger conversation. In a lot of ways, I've taken as the baseline for my conversation about what the word monster means is Jeffrey Jerome Cohen's essay, Monster Culture: Seven Theses. Although that's really more of what a monster does. He's eerily right in all seven of these. And a lot of, monster is a lot of any creature that kind of challenges. A monster is any creature that does those things. It challenges boundaries. It polices the borders of what is possible. It demonstrates what you should and should not do. It embodies the idea of the enemy, other, and the stranger. In that sort of loose generalizing, where there's only two stories ever told: the voyage of discovery and a stranger comes to town. And a voyage of discovery is adventure, and the stranger is horror. Um, so there, and the I think to kind of wrap up the answer to that question before we get too far in the weeds is that if you ask six people what the word monster means, you will get at least seven answers. And I know this because I have, and that's what happened.
Well, that's probably a good line. I mentioned your podcast, and it is called Baking a Monster. So tell us about the podcast.
Uh, make Thanks for asking. Making a Monster is a bite-sized podcast that asks uh, a game designer about a monster of their choice. I noticed that there's a lot of long form content in Dungeons and Dragons. It takes hours to play, and fantasy books tend to be long and indulgent, and we're very used to that. I was really, I was more interested in doing something with a scope that I felt was comfortable and hospitable. And when you talk about one monster in particular, you can be very, very specific about what it is and what it does and why it means what it does and why it makes you feel the way it makes you feel. And doing it with game designers has been fascinating because these are people who have to not only handle all of the literary and cultural associations that a monster necessarily carries. One of the theses being a monster's body is a cultural body. Every culture has their own monsters and they all tell them different ways. But you have to take all of that and then assign numbers to it. You have to code it into the system, whether it's Dungeons and Dragons or the Unity game engine. At some point, you have to say numerically, this monster has more strength and ferocity than this monster.
Mm-hmm.
A vampire hits harder than a werewolf. And that is incredibly fascinating to me. I think if you're a paleontologist, you might see this as an exercise in provenance. It's I cannot let, I feel really bad just having all of these monsters floating through the world. D&D has begged, borrowed, and stolen from every mythos and pantheon there is. It's a bit like the British Museum in that regard. Uh, um, but if you look at the difference between Bram Stoker's Dracula and Stephanie Meyer's Edward Cullen, you can start to see why this conversation might be useful and illuminating. And it's why I'm still having the same conversation about 3 years later.
If we're in the business of recommending podcasts, and we seem to be at the moment, then Stuff the British Stole by Mark Fennell from the Australian, and this is produced by the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, the ABC, and it's a great podcast. So yeah.
I can't. I didn't mean to go after the British so hard. I wasn't trying to.
It's a no, well, it's a conversation we're used to having down here at the moment in Australia, because with the coronation just recently, and we're having the Republic debate seems to be kicking off here again, and we're also having a conversation about a referendum later in the year to recognise Indigenous Australians in the Constitution through what's called a voice. So it's a permanent mechanism enshrined in the Constitution for Indigenous Australians to have a say in government.
Yeah.
These conversations are pretty common here at the moment, actually.
Yeah.
But yeah,
I mean, I'm glad you're having it. Because if looking at the history of extinctions has taught me anything, it's that our relationship with extinct animals is very often the same as our relationship with indigenous populations. Um, it's an issue that I've had to be more cognizant of, and in the process of writing this book.
The world is facing really severe environmental challenges, including, conservation and climate change and those issues. And you kind of are coming at that when you're talking about extinction out of necessity. As a storyteller, how do you think that creative work can address these issues? It's a huge question to finish on.
No, it's just, I think if you had asked me that 2 years ago when I started writing the book, the answer might have been slightly different. Um, I have like I'm at the desk where I write this book, and I have in this like square footage, I think gone through all five of the stages of grief. I've been mad, I've been exhausted, I've been just heartbroken, and I think that um, I think that we can get people's minds on this. Like I can tell you that 68% of life on Earth has disappeared since 1970, according to the World Wildlife Federation. I can tell you that 100 to 1,000 times the background rate is the current rate that extinctions are happening. I can tell you that I can point to 2.5C as the breaking point for climate change. And I can tell you all of these numbers and try to get you to realize that it's an urgent and immediate problem. But I don't think uh, that there's anything more compelling I can do than to show you.
Mhm.
Um, all of the naturalists and advocates that I've read about in the course of putting this book together, um, people like Alfred Russel Wallace and uh, Rosalie Edge, uh, have been motivated almost to a man by, again, almost to a person by uh, an early encounter with nature that really shaped their minds. For me, it was fireflies. Like every June, there's about 2 weeks where the lightning bugs come out and they turn every backyard in Midwest America into a twinkling constellation that is totally harmless. You just get to walk through it, and if you're gentle and careful, you can hold them in your hand. Uh, and that, like, if extinction ever comes for the fireflies, I'm going to lose my mind. uh, but there are fewer and fewer opportunities for people to have those kinds of compelling personal encounters with the natural world. I mean, we're born into a world with fewer fellow creatures on it every year. So to be able to do this in terms of Dungeons and Dragons is to be able to give people the opportunity, not just to like, this isn't about raising awareness, this is about participation. In the way, there will be a point, Travis, when you stop talking about your D&D character as you with like second
Mhm.
person pronouns, and when you start talking about them as I or we. And let me know when that happens, because that's when it's crossed the threshold over to a different kind of memory. It's as
Yeah.
real and legitimate as something that actually happened to you. It sits in the same part of the brain. And being able to use that to give people those encounters, to give them new fireflies and new monarch butterflies and new chances to stare into the wild green light in the wolf's eyes, is what this can do that nothing else can.
I think that's a really lovely point to end on. Lucas Zellers, thank you so much for chatting to me on Fossils and Fiction.
Thanks for having me, Travis. I'm excited to be here. It's been a great conversation, and I'm looking forward to to pulling more meaning out of the monsters that we're digging up out of the earth. Good luck in the rest of this project.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to this episode of Fossils and Fiction. We're always looking for more paleo stories to tell and welcome your suggestions through our social channels. You can also send voice notes via Spotify or social media. Podcast theme music is Sonora by Quincast Morea via the YouTube audio library. Show notes are available on the website, fossilsfiction.co. Please subscribe and rate the podcast on your preferred podcasting platform.